My name is Elle Richards, and I'm a manager of cities with Vibrant Communities. I'm excited to introduce a conversation today with Hanifa Kassam and Nate Stevens. Welcome again to today's webinar, and I'm excited to introduce our speakers today. We have Hanifa and Nate. Hanifa Kassam is a Community Development Officer with the City of Toronto's Poverty Reduction Strategy Office. In this capacity, she has oversight over a range of poverty reduction strategy activities, including efforts to engage residents with first-hand experience of poverty in the design of city programs and policies. Hanifa is also the staff lead for Anchor TO, a network of 17 public sector institutions in Toronto, focused on leveraging their economic power to achieve greater social impact. We also have Nate Stevens with us today. Nate is the manager for Anchor Collaborative Network. As manager of the ACN, Nate works with the city and community-based local wealth building collaboratives across the US and Canada. Member collaboratives made up of communities, anchor institutions, governments, and backbone organizations share diverse approaches to equitable and inclusive community development. This network explores how collaboration among anchors and communities multiplies the effects of their coordinated strategies and how the assets of large community institutions can spark change. I would also like to welcome one of Nate's colleagues, Claire Groby, who's in the background there to help manage some of the questions towards the end. So I'll hand it over right now to the presentation with Hanifa and Nate. Over to you.
Great, thanks Elle and Hannah, and thank all of you for attending our webinar today. As Elle said, my name is Nate Stevens. I'm the manager of the Anchor Collaborative Network, which is hosted by the Democracy Collaborative. The image you see here is representative of, is an outdated representation of our membership. We're finding more and more cities and communities doing this kind of work, but it kind of gives you an idea of the breadth. So first to contextualize, the Democracy Collaborative, the organization I represent, is a research and backbone organization studying and connecting the dots on inclusive and equitable local development. And my part in this presentation is going to be setting the scene a little bit for Hanifa to give the example and case study from Toronto. So I'm going to quickly walk through who we are as TDC and how the Anchor Collaborative Network fits in before elaborating a little bit more about our work and partners. So Hannah, if we can go to the next slide. I always think it's helpful to start with a glossary and just make sure that we're operating from shared understanding. So the first term that I want to introduce is community wealth building, which is really the foundational framework and theory for the Democracy Collaborative and for this work. Basically, it's an alternative economic development paradigm focused on building collaborative, inclusive, and locally owned economies. So it's really about looking at economic development as creating shared prosperity, not just growth for its own sake, which is often the case. Within community wealth building, we talk about the existing assets and capital within communities and how they can be rethought or redirected to service residents. And that leads us to the next term, which is anchor institution. This term has been becoming more and more common, I think, in the past few years. But at the Democracy Collaborative, we see anchor institutions as public serving institutions, and we do prioritize public nonprofit institutions as we think about this, who anchor local economies and are rooted in place. And so we think about these institutions as essential local assets whose spending, hiring, and investing, and many more things that we can get into, can be put back into the community. So we know that anchor institutions like hospitals or institutions of higher education are often the biggest employers and spenders in a community. So how can they be more thoughtful about contributing that capital and their power to developing an inclusive and equitable local economy. And the last term, and this is really the connection to the work that all of you are doing in vibrant communities. The Anchor Collaborative Network is a group of place-based collaboratives. So we're a network of networks where cities and communities are bringing together diverse multi-stakeholder groups to engage anchors in community wealth building at scale. So this is really bringing in all of the different diverse forms of capital, including cultural capital, human, intellectual, and the role of community-based organizations to bring community and anchors together to develop these strategies. So we're going to focus, I think, primarily in this conversation on procurement. Social procurement is about using one particular lever within anchor institutions to contract locally. But with this slide, I just kind of wanted to contextualize that community wealth building is a larger conversation that we're engaged in. We can go to the next slide. So within this, I don't think it's usually best practice to show an organizational chart in a webinar, but I just wanted to flash this to show that the Democracy Collaborative takes an inside-outside approach to working with anchor institutions. And so on the left-hand side here, you can see that within what we're currently calling the Center for Anchor Strategies, we have 3 different networks, and it's helpful to understand how they overlap and complement each other. First, we have the Healthcare Anchor Network, which is made up of more than 40 healthcare institutions across the country, working to figure out from within a healthcare institution, from within healthcare, how can they be adopting an anchor mission and addressing the particular opportunities and challenges within healthcare. On the right side, you can see the Anchor Learning Network, which is a similar network we convene in partnership with the Coalition of Urban and Metropolitan Universities that's focusing on the role of universities and colleges, higher education as anchors. So really learning from each other as institutions of higher education. And then the Anchor Collaborative Network is right in the middle, because this network is really made up of the folks who are convening healthcare and universities in their communities. And so we're kind of working at a couple of different levels here, which opens up some interesting opportunities. And then lastly, I'll just mention that we also work one-on-one with anchor institutions and initiatives through our advisory branch. Next slide. So this map gives you kind of a bit more of a complete picture of our anchor network reach. You can see those, the green triangles are the Anchor Collaborative members. So those are the cities and communities that are really trying to do this at scale and to get several anchor institutions and community groups at the table. The red circles you see, those are health institutions and their healthcare institutions and their hospitals and clinics in the smaller circles. So you can see that there's a really wide reach there, as well as the blue squares, which represent our higher education members. So there's lots of potential in connecting the dots here between what's the changes that have to happen inside an institution and the incentives and culture outside an institution that really makes that possible and encourages it. So we're just kind of getting started on connecting the dots with this. Next slide. And here are some of our members. You can see currently we have a heavy emphasis on the United States. I underlined and bolded Toronto there, just to highlight that Hanifa and her colleagues are currently our sole representative from Canada. So as Tamarack partners are listening, we would love to better understand the landscape in Canada and engage in conversation about that. But what I'd like to emphasize by showing this list, which really represents the many regions across the United States. It represents some of the largest cities in the country. We have a couple of member collaboratives based in New York and the region. Chicago, we're working with some folks in DC. But we're also doing this and finding work popping up in smaller communities. So in Cayuga County, New York, which is a fairly rural county with Auburn, New York as the largest city, they're also trying to think about, okay, as a rural community, as a county, which only has maybe seven anchor institutions. What are the implications of this for us? How can we do this? And we're finding that there's a lot of potential with this framework, as well as a lot of flexibility, which I'll refer to in just a second. Next slide. So our work within the Anchor Collaborative Network has, up until now at least, been broken down into these four working groups. In addition to these groups, which meet monthly, we also have two annual convenings where we bring the network together in person and do a deep dive into the context of a member city and their work, as well as really take advantage of being in person to connect some of the dots on lessons people are learning, and also build some solidarity around this. As many of you know, working in collaboration and being the person representing collaboration is often kind of a lonely post at home. So this is a good community for folks to come together around that shared role. To break down the themes of work that we've started on in these working groups, first we have a group called the Community of Early Practice, which is a really exciting group representing communities that are either just getting started on adopting an anchor collaborative approach, or who have been working as a collaborative for a while and are looking to re-inject some new energy or need a new strategic direction. And this group consists of regionally organized peer coaching, so collaboratives talking to each other about talking through their issues and proposing solutions, as well as a series of what we're planning for the next several months is a series of introductory speakers to really deepen particular areas of members' interests and priorities. So this topic that we're talking about right now, social procurement, is of interest of a lot of anchor collaborative leaders who are trying to get a better handle on, as someone from outside a hospital or university, how do I get in? What's the approach? And I think we're going to hear a little bit more from Hanifa in a little bit about that. The next group is called Strategies to Get to Systems Change, which is really explicitly addressing the power of these groups to shift their local systems, their local political and economic systems to something more equitable and sustainable. So this group is bringing complex issues or systems-oriented approaches to systems clinics within this working group for us to all brainstorm and workshop through these complicated issues and strategies that people are adopting. And we'll be introducing systems thinking frameworks and tools to help guide that as well. We also have a group focusing on anchor collaborative success factors, which is, they're doing really exciting deep thinking on what are the theories of change behind this collaborative work. And the groups participating in this are really starting to lay the groundwork for future data collection and research into what makes these groups work and how can we best leverage these local assets. And then lastly, taking advantage of one particular kind of tool within the community wealth building toolkit, we have a group focusing on employee ownership ecosystems. Employee ownership is a fantastic tool that we have to build local wealth and build the assets of folks who own the businesses and organizations for which they work. And the exciting thing about this group is that because of their positions as conveners, folks are thinking about this from an ecosystem perspective. So what are the different pieces that need to be in place to support employee ownership in a community, including cooperative developers, community finance institutions, and then beyond that, so once you have a healthy employee ownership ecosystem, how do you plug those employee-owned businesses into the anchors and their procurement? So we're approaching this from several different angles, but the common thread here is how can anchor institutions be involved in lending their resources and power to this social change? Next slide, please. And then lastly, before I turn it over to Hanifa, who I think with her example will make all of this much clearer, I just wanted to share a few examples of some of our member collaboratives and the diverse work that they're doing. It was and always is a challenge to select from our members because I'm so excited by so many of their approaches. But I just wanted to highlight a few who are doing innovative things with social procurement in particular. First of all, we have the Washington, D.C. Community Anchor Partnership, just right down the street from us, where I'm sitting right now, actually. And that partnership is convened by an organization called the Coalition of Nonprofit Housing and Economic Development. And they have a partnership with the city to streamline and elevate procurement and hiring from marginalized neighborhoods in Washington, D.C. And what's really cool about this group is that they're convened by an economic development network. And so a lot of the economic development players in DC are participating in this collaborative and contributing their voices and elevating the perspective of the community as a part of that. We also have the Atlanta Wealth Building Initiative, which is doing great work in very explicitly working to preserve Black businesses and to engage their more than 50 partners to start a movement in West Atlanta. They're doing that by institutionalizing municipal procurement to support Black-owned businesses, and they're also starting to think about how they can support conversion of legacy Black-owned businesses to employee-owned business as founders and owners retire. And the last group that I'll mention before we get into our deep dive example with Hanifa is from Denver, Colorado, where an organization called the Center for Community Wealth Building convenes a group called the Denver Anchor Network. And they're taking advantage of a huge municipal public-private partnership that's constructing a new event space in Denver. It's going to be called the National Western Center, hosting the U.S. stock show and rodeos and things. And so this group is, among other strategies taking place in their neighborhoods, they're engaging anchors to support immigrant-owned, employee-owned businesses in constructing and then maintaining and operating this event center in the future. And so really taking advantage of a window of opportunity in the community as another entry point. So before turning it over to Hanifa, really what I'd like to emphasize is that a lot of collaboratives have started or are starting with social procurement as an entry point to launch into more diverse and comprehensive economic change. But the diverse entry points in this network and the many ways that communities are going about marshaling their local assets and starting to think differently about economic development is really what I find most exciting about this group. And I'll turn it over to Hanifa right now to give us some more insight into what she's been leading in Toronto.
Great, thank you, Nate. And I hope everyone sort of got some context as to where Anchor TO is coming into this work. And I hope to share a little bit more details as to what that looks like. But before I get started, I just wanted to highlight a few areas that I'll be going over so people have context. I'll begin this presentation by highlighting how this work with anchors and how Anchor TO is couched within the City of Toronto's poverty reduction strategy. And I'll focus very briefly on some of the work that the City of Toronto is doing as an anchor, and then I'll move into our work as the lead for Anchor TO. Next slide, please. So poverty in Toronto is growing economically. Social inequality is a significant threat to our long-term success as a city. According to 2016 census data, 1 in 5 adults and 1 in 4 children continue to live in poverty in Toronto, as measured by the low-income measure. Additionally, while those living in poverty are distributed throughout the city, certain neighborhoods continue to experience a higher than average concentration of poverty. These neighborhoods tend to be highly racialized and in the inner suburbs. According to the Government of Canada's official poverty line, the market basket measure, the City of Toronto has a rate of poverty that is almost 1.5 times higher than the Greater Toronto Census metropolitan area. It also has 1.7 times higher than the provincial rate and 1.8 times higher than the national rate, based on 2017 Canadian income security data. Poverty also continues to be disproportionately experienced by certain populations, including those who are socially isolated, singles, vulnerable seniors, Indigenous communities, and equity-seeking groups such as Black Torontonians, racialized youth, and residents with a disability. The Toronto Poverty Reduction Strategy was approved by City Council in November of 2015, setting an ambitious 20-year plan to mitigate the effects of poverty and to reduce the incidence among Toronto residents, using various tools and resources available to city and as a local government. In addition to adopting the 20-year poverty reduction strategy, City Council also approved the 2015 to 2018 Term Action Plan and directed staff to bring forward and update the Term Action Plan every 4 years, coinciding with each term of council over the 20-year life cycle of the strategy. In 2019, the 2019 to 2022 Term Action Plan went forward to City Council and was unanimously approved. This report included a series of actions that aligned with the city's original 17 recommendations in 6 thematic areas, including housing stability, service access, transportation equity, food access, quality jobs and livable incomes, and systemic change. Recommended in the 2019 to 2022 Poverty Reduction Strategy Term Action Plan were 2 actions that focus on leveraging inclusive economic development as a key pillar to poverty reduction strategy. These include leveraging operating infrastructure spending to create targeted hiring, training opportunities, providing economic opportunities, and support to community priorities. Additionally, develop sustainable models for inclusive economic development. This is where our work on Anchor TO is couched, with an activity that specifically focuses on leading and coordinating anchor institutions to increase community-based investment, hiring, and purchasing. Next slide, please. With direction from the Poverty Reduction Strategy, the city has been actively working on these recommendations. To date, some of these high-level achievements include the Social Procurement Policy and Program, which was approved in 2016 and began implementation in 2017. Social procurement is the practice of using an organization's procurement to create social and economic outcomes. The idea behind social procurement is that the dollars we spend get used twice, once for operations and again for social impact to achieve a double bottom line. Social procurement is about leveraging even a small proportion of our procurement spend to create economic opportunities for people experiencing economic disadvantage, systemic discrimination, and barriers to equal access. Within an $11 billion annual budget and 35,000 employees, the Toronto government is a critical anchor for inclusive economic growth in a city where 1 in 4 and 1 in 5 live in poverty. But even smaller jurisdictions can achieve and use social procurement as a powerful tool. In addition to this achievement, we've also entered into a community benefit agreement with One Toronto Gaming at Casino Woodbine in Rexdale. And most recently, the city adopted the community benefits framework, which focuses on creating equitable pathways to economic development for people from equity-seeking groups. Next slide, please. As you can see, the city has been working immensely to focus on how, as an anchor itself, it could make systemic and social impact. But what we recognized early on in this work is that what we were learning and what we were doing as a city could also be leveraged and shared amongst those institutions that we work and partner with across the City of Toronto. In 2014, we worked with the Atkinson Foundation to launch Anchor TO. This work was couched in the vision that Imagine the impact we can have in Toronto if we leverage the city's procurement budget alongside other large anchor institutions. Slowly together, we are working to leverage an annual $17 billion possibility towards inclusive economic development. Next slide, please. So we are focusing on the Ontario public sector because the Ontario public sector procures billions of dollars of goods and services each year. The public sector institutions are powerful economic engines. Post-secondary institutions alone spend over $3 billion. Next slide, please. Nate referred to this notion of place-based in his definitions when he introduced his presentation. And I think along those lines, I'd like to share the concept of sticky capital in aligned with place-based. For us, and the importance of place-based comes with the notion of sticky capital. We know that public sector institutions are often not disappearing, they're often growing. And in the picture that you see in this slide is represented by the University of Toronto Scarborough campus's master plan. And much like this, other anchor institutions are looking to grow, looking to develop deeper roots, and looking to develop better connections with their local communities with respect to anchor strategies. Next slide, please. So to put this all into perspective, the values shown on this slide tell you that there is a lot of opportunity, billions of dollars of worth. And if we compare that to some of the strategies we've been using historically, there is a lot of room to grow when we think about our opportunity within the community wealth building framework. Next slide, please. So to look at Toronto's work to date and in the context of how we've traditionally operated as a funder versus a leverager of our economic power, the City of Toronto currently procures over $1.8 billion in resources and services. Compare that to how much we distribute in community grants. You can see that there's a lot of room and opportunity if we were to think about how we use our resources differently. Next slide, please. Our goal with Anchor TO is to collectively use our addressable spend. In 2019, we put forward a pitch between the City of Toronto and all other anchors that are a part of our work to push us into operationalizing what 5% of our operational spend in the areas of workforce, investment, and community capacity would be. And currently our work is focused on breathing life into this 5%. What could it look like? How do we do it? And how can we do it together? Next slide, please. Our ultimate goal here is to have a triple bottom line impact, one that is both financial, environmental, and social. Next slide, please. The remainder of the slides that I'm going to go over are going to highlight how Anchor TO has been doing this over the past several years and also where we're at in the stage of work to date. The work of Anchor TO has been broken down into 3 phases. Initially in 2014, this work was all about figuring out if the work around social procurement and other community benefit activities were even possible. Since then, we've moved on to phase 2, which has focused on how do we move from possibility into action. And we recently began phase 3, which was to move forward on our action and to focus on sustainability. Next slide, please. One thing to keep in mind in all of this work are the drivers of community wealth building, which anchor and act as a grounding to this work. As you can see, many of these concepts were highlighted by the work that is being done by the Anchor Collaborative Network, but they also act as a framework of what local economic development can and could look like and does look like for particular anchors. For example, again, the University of Toronto Scarborough campus uses this framework specifically to map out its anchor strategies, but also impact. Next slide, please. Some of our achievements to date as an anchor TO include frameworks and tools that have been distributed across our network, a community of practice where anchors are able to come together to learn from one another, to share resources, to share experiences, and to learn and lean off each other for support. In 2019, we also held our first Anchor TO Summit. This summit was a two-day summit which not only brought together anchors that focused on better understanding and speaking in a more deep and impactful way around the mechanics of social procurement, but for the first time, we also convened community partners who are doing this work with us to talk about how their levers are affecting the work of the ecosystem that surrounds community benefits. Next slide, please. The summit was also hosted in recognition that our work as an anchor, our work as an anchor in an ecosystem of inclusive economic development cannot be done alone. Our ability to move forward in this work and to have long-lasting, sustainable social change is contingent on our work and our ability to work with others. And so we look forward to continuing to do more work in collaboration with community, but also to support our community of anchors to be able to thrive and grow in their interest and their opportunity of both social procurement and other community benefit activities. Next slide. And that is all I have for now, and I look forward to questions.
Great. Elle, we have Claire distilling some questions for us here, and I can read the first one. So the first question is there any work being done to rethink the way that we measure wealth and value in our economies, moving beyond just economic measures? This is a really interesting one. I have an answer, but Hanifa, do you want to kick it off?
I would love to hear your answer first.
Okay. Well, so my answer is that we are also very interested in this question. I can turn my video back on. We're also very interested in this question. And so currently our focus from an evaluative perspective, we've been working on something we're calling the Anchor Dashboard, which one of our colleagues has been leading in the Healthcare Anchor Network. And that's starting to break down and look at the data for social procurement in a different way. So first of all, I think that that's helpful, is actually having the data to know what % of contracts are going to minority-owned businesses or women-owned businesses or whatever kind of traditionally marginalized or excluded demographic is being prioritized. So just starting with that data already has you looking in a different direction, which is great. From a collaborative level, I'm really interested in exploring this question. And we've been talking, and as I mentioned, the Success Factors group is going to be digging into this. So I'll have a better answer for you in 6 months or so. But a few different places that I've been thinking to evaluate would be looking at the relationships and process that are underway. I see a lot of this work as opening up new spaces for community members to help make decisions, help set agendas, help determine how these resources and assets are used. So looking at that. And then I think we want to start looking more at how organizations working very explicitly in systems change, like Tamarack and others, are thinking about evaluating systems change, because it does go far beyond just economic change, as the question proposes. So branching into those other forms of capital that are also essential is going to be really important for us. So I'm excited by the question, and I will hopefully get back to you in the future with some clear answers from our network members.
Great. Nate, do you want to share the next question?
Sure. So the next one from Jamal is, what strategies did you use to gain support from government entities? Did it vary a lot by location?
So I can jump in and speak to what some of the strategies were for Toronto specifically. And Nate, maybe you want to share some of the experiences that you're aware of across the ACN network. So Toronto has been, in many ways, attempting to do social procurement for a number of years, with a number of city-led or city-funded builds. And I think, the story goes is that there are several attempts that were failed. So my first strategy is perseverance. The leadership within the city's social development and finance division was relentless in figuring out how to pursue a strategy and a policy framework that would not only be something that could effectively, in a systemic way, change the way that the city of Toronto addressed procurement, but in addition to that, has continued to leverage our relationship with other institutions to bring them along the way, hence the Anchor TO network. Another thing that we've focused on is making sure that the highest order of leadership has bought into this understanding of social procurement to be able to both contribute resources to it, but also to back it to a place where there's understanding that results are not going to be seen immediately. This work takes time. The work for the City of Toronto has been in it since 2014, and we are now in 2020, and we're only beginning to see the impact of that systems change that we began so many years ago.
Yeah, I'll just add a couple of things. So as I mentioned in my portion of the presentation, in the Anchor Collaborative Network, these collective community wealth building initiatives are being convened by really diverse organizations and institutions. So some of these groups, like Anchor TO, are convened by someone from city government themselves. So in that case, you have somebody within city government to help promote and build buy-in. There are other collaboratives that are convened by a nonprofit organization, or in the case of our member in Tucson, the Community Food Bank of Southern Arizona, where you're starting from much more of an outsider position relative to city government. So my recommendation, based on talking with people who are taking these diverse approaches, is to start with your champions. Start where it makes most sense and where there seems to be energy, and it starts to get contagious, I would say. And that applies both within institutions. So I think my colleagues in the Healthcare Anchor Network and Anchor Learning Network would say the same thing when working with Anchor institutions. But it applies to the collaboratives as well. So it might be starting small, which is another good approach. People talk about quick wins a lot. As Hanifa alluded, I'm not always 100% sure what constitutes a quick win when we're talking systems change. But I think that's a reason we start with social procurement in a lot of cases. It's still difficult to track based on our current priorities and systems, but it's easier to demonstrate that shift in addressable spend. But yeah, I would say starting with champions. All right, our next question from Michelle, specifically for Hanifa. First, and it looks like a two-part. You mentioned some tools that you developed to support social procurement. Can you describe those a bit? And then the second part, actually, Hanifa, do you want to take that one and then I can give you the second?
Sure. So over the past year and a half, Anchor TO has been working with its network to develop what we're referring to as the Anchor TO Blueprint, which effectively is a resource to help institutions, whether they be public or private, work through how to go about building a social procurement framework and strategy and product within their institution. And we hope to publish that in this year. We are also working to translate it into a toolkit version so that it comes with additional user resources so that they can be applied within an institution or tweaked rather than being recreated from scratch. In terms of other resources, as I mentioned, we had the 2019 Anchor TO Summit. We have a very bare bone resource website, which is anchorto.ca, and our publications from that conference will be up in the next few weeks. So you can see what people shared, but also what stories and information was shared by both the city, but also the anchors who participated and the community leaders that also participated at that summit.
Great. And the second question from this person, and I'm eager to hear your answer to this. In Denver, we have found that shifting catering spending to local women or minority-owned businesses has been low-hanging fruit. What low-hanging fruit have you discovered in Toronto?
I don't know if I'm the best person to answer that.
But I think yeah, go ahead, Anita.
So I would say that the low-hanging fruit, it doesn't apply directly, but and that's to say because we approached social procurement from a policy framework rather than a supply-demand framework. Mm-hmm. So we have gone beyond the testing where you may be able to be very specific to a low-hanging fruit opportunity. And because we have a very specific policy framework that requires us to follow suit on specific thresholds and how social procurement applies within each threshold, the low-hanging fruit is not necessarily a strategy that we can use. That being said, to whomever said this question, I'd be happy to have an offline conversation because I do know that there was testing of the social procurement strategy that happened prior to its implementation, which was before my time. So I'm happy to figure out what that has looked like. Having been involved with this work for the past 18 months more specifically, I commonly suggest that institutions approach this work by what seems to be the low-hanging fruit and most feasible. I think, Nate, you just mentioned that, like, go where the energy is, go where the opportunity is, make sure that the legislation that your jurisdiction falls under is compliant with that flexibility, and try it out. Because it's not, and this is in the words of many of our anchors, it's hard to learn this work without doing it. So we commonly refer to ourselves as sort of flying the plane by building it at the same time. And I would say that is something that we're commonly aware of. So don't let the policy piece get in front of you and be the reason that you can't do this work. If you see opportunity in being able to work with a particular sector, that there is institutional leadership to test strategies out, then go for it.
At the Democracy Collaborative, we've also found that in some cases, there are some particular industries that that seem particularly primed for this kind of work. Some of you might be familiar with the Evergreen Cooperatives in Cleveland, Ohio, which are 3 worker-owned cooperatives that are supporting some essential contracting needs of the major hospitals in Cleveland. And so one of them is an industrial laundry. As you would imagine, the laundry burden at a hospital is huge, and most of that work is contracted to outside companies. And so building a locally owned industrial laundry localized that spending. And we're looking at how that model, as well as a few others, home care is interesting, how others can be plugged in to this model. But I think, as Hanifa mentioned, it really is contextual to each community, which is good. I mean, that's an advantage. So the recommendation would be to build on the opportunities that are there, just like with any business endeavor. Startups are the hardest way to go, but looking at supply and demand, while not always the best way or the only way to look at it, as Hanifa highlighted, it can give you, looking at what businesses are in the community that both have the capacity or the interest and meet the needs of anchors, particularly those businesses that are from marginalized communities. I think that can be a really effective way to start.
Nate, if I could just jump on that comment one more time, is I think the question sort of also highlights the importance of engaging with community when we're thinking about what do we actually mean by low-hanging fruit, and who is it low-hanging fruit for? And what we haven't talked about today in any great detail is the importance and the value of community engagement and community development in building out anchor strategies successfully. So just I highlight that here.
Absolutely. I'll give an exclamation point to affirm that. Hanifa and I talk quite a bit about the importance of this work being community-led, and I really see the anchor collaboratives as bringing together the power and influence of the anchor institutions with the perspective and needs of the community. So really, that should be, we're interested in learning more about community engagement and how some of the models that I'm sure all of you are developing in your Vibrant Communities work can support community engagement with anchor strategies. Great. Another question here. As cities organize themselves into neighborhoods, would the low-hanging fruit not be at least similar, albeit perhaps organized via different strata? Yeah, I think, and maybe Hanifa, you can talk to this a little bit too, but I think these strategies do work very well when they are almost hyper-localized, or at least very specific in the neighborhoods that they're targeting. And that would also give you a clearer perspective on what businesses are in that neighborhood that need to be plugged in. But yeah, those, even within a city, different neighborhoods will have a different business ecosystem, of course.
Absolutely, and for us, we find that the anchor members of our network define and use criteria in ways that work best for their institution and are often in response to their local communities.
Great. A question from Josh. Are there strong examples of this anchor network work in the education field that is focused on improving education/equity across a city or region? That's a really interesting one. Actually, I was talking with my colleague, Julia Anderson, who manages the higher education network. And we were talking about in the healthcare anchor network, we talk a lot about the social determinants of health. So in talking about this being, this work really being very aligned and supportive of the mission that healthcare institutions have, taking into account how social conditions contribute to health. In Julia's network, a few folks have started to talk about the social determinants of education and looking at the work through that framework. I don't have much more for you than that right now, but I think that is, as we explore more how higher education institutions are playing into this, I think that might be an effective framing to get buy-in on that. Hanifa, anything to add about education and equity?
Unfortunately, that's not been an angle that we have been working on with our anchor institutions, although they are education institutions.
Okay. A question from Jaka. Does your strategy include review of investment managers? Is investment a part of Anchor TO's strategy, Hanifa?
Not yet, but I sure hope so. Investment is an area that we introduced last year. We have not yet moved into what that actually means concretely. But with the rise in social finance and impact investing, we absolutely see that there's potential there.
Yeah, and I'll just give a small plug for the Democracy Collaborative's work in this as well. We often talk about the three pillars of anchor mission work being buying, hiring, and investing. And so we have some working groups, especially in the Healthcare Anchor Network, that are looking at how anchor institutions can use their investments, and in the case of universities, endowments, to invest in affordable housing, in workforce development, in some of those more infrastructural and systemic changes. Maybe we have time for a couple more. I think this one's really important from Susan. How does social procurement align with current financial obligations regarding tendering? I know you've been having lots of conversations about that, Hanifa.
So this is a very technical question, which is not my expertise. But to whomever asked this question, I'd be happy to share the information that we have about how this is possible, and that we don't and are not limited by our legislative requirements, and so on and so forth. But and these are questions that and in line with this question were the challenges that we explored as a network, made up of many procurement professionals and the legal teams of anchor institutions early on in this work to overcome the skepticism, but also the uncertainty as to whether this was even possible in the first place.
All right. From Abby, are there complementary strategies supporting the development of employee/community-owned businesses? Yes, absolutely. I've learned so much about this in my past few months at the Democracy Collaborative. So we're actually going to be looking at some different system strengthening approaches to supporting employee ownership. So looking at city and state initiatives, policy-driven initiatives to mobilize. Several cities and states are working from that point of view. There's also we could also approach employee-owned businesses through conversions. In the case of Atlanta, as I mentioned, and some others in our network, working to preserve local business and preserve local business through employee ownership, as particularly baby boomers are retiring and selling these millions of baby boomer-owned businesses, as a way to keep that locally owned and plugged into anchor contracting, ideally. They're also, and this is getting into some of the technical stuff of employee ownership, but there are also several forms of employee ownership. And so I think often we think our minds jump immediately to cooperatives when employee stock option plans, ESOPs are also a form of employee ownership that we explore. Yeah, there are several different models to go about that that we'd be excited to talk about in the future as well, if you'd like to reach out.
And I'd also highlight that that specific area is also a priority of our second term action plan for the poverty reduction strategy. So we haven't sort of broken any ground on it just yet, but it will be something that we begin to look at and explore from a municipal perspective in the coming months and years.
Hanifa, I have a working group that would be very helpful for you as you get started.
No more working groups.
Hanifa is one of our super users who's very involved in our working groups. One last question maybe from Ken. Social procurement could be a way to partner with and engage businesses to help solve social challenges. Is the Anchor Collaborative Network consulting with businesses? That's an interesting question. The answer is no, as of yet. And I think of it as really supporting more of the conditions to support businesses. So working with Anchor Collaboratives is working more at the systems level, and working with the folks supporting businesses and businesses who are trying to adopt a double or triple bottom line. But we haven't been working directly with businesses as such. Although I think maybe we have done advisory work, particularly with cooperative startup and things like that. Elle, I see you coming back on, which is probably a cue. But I also just wanted to acknowledge folks who shared resources in the comments. Sherry shared a resource about health equity from UK Health, and a couple of other people as well. So thank you. We're excited to be engaged in this conversation with you all.
Thank you. Thank you, Nate. And Hanifa, thanks so much for your sharing your presentation. And in this conversation, thank you so much to everyone who sent in your questions. It's definitely a topic that is very, very big, and there's lots of conversations that we can carry forward through this. We will share some of those resources that were shared in the chat box. We will make sure that we send those in our follow-up communication from today. So we'll just wrap up the last couple of minutes we have. We just want to we have some closing announcements. The first one is just around to stay in touch with our Tamarack Institute and Vibrant Communities community. You can connect to receive our newsletter and sign up to receive other communication regarding lots of our events that are coming up. We also have some upcoming webinars. This one in particular in February, we are going to have Tamarack's own Paul Bourne and the Vancouver Foundation's Lydia Kemi as they explore how to engage community to get input on a particular issue. We also have, we're also inviting or calling all Canadian youth photographers with a photography competition. Any person under 30 is invited to capture photos of what they would like their community to look like 10 years from now in 2030. So it's an exciting opportunity to engage with youth, and there's cash prizes available for this. So in a few days, to close, in a few days' time, you will receive a follow-up email from us, and it will include a link to the audio recording of today's call, as well as some learning opportunities just mentioned. We will include all the follow-up resources attached with this. And if you do want to connect further, please feel free to send feedback, comments, questions to myself. We can connect with Hanifa and Nate as well going forward if there's some follow-up questions. For now, I would like to thank Hanifa and Nate for contributing to this webinar and for the great conversation today.